True. So, yeah, so this is very much a budding interest in the dative construction. So maybe not a budding interest, but it's a budding research output in the area. I've been kind of thinking about it for quite some time. In particular, since I sat in a seminar on argument structure in Chris Collins' seminar here at 2018. So, and he had another seminar on argument structure last year. So that's very much pushed me forward into thinking about this. So thanks to Chris for that. So as I said, I'm going to be talking about the dative alternation, right? Let's make sure I get the slides forward. So let me introduce, well, I'm not talking about the dative alternation, I'm talking about prepositional datives, precisely not about the alternation, because I'm talking about Irish and Scottish Gaelic. I should preface that, by the way, that moment of sloppiness, to warn you that there might be more sloppiness in these slides. So like I decided to move into slides from a handout up until just on Tuesday. So the slides are a conversion of a handout, and I will share the slides. Do you know what? I should actually share the slides where I'm talking, if you don't mind, because I know a lot of people like to have slides and to look at, but I can continue to jabber on while I do that. So yeah, I just want to preface this by pointing out that these slides are still relatively new, and they have a lot of typos, and in particular, you know, typos and accents in the wrong places, things like that. Related to that is the issue that I'm a non-existent Gaelic speaker. I don't speak Gaelic. So like whenever I do something on Gaelic, I'm very careful about it. I work for a long time with the speakers that I work with. And so the generalizations and the claims about the data, they should be right. But whenever I publish something or finalize something, I have to spend a lot of time with that to make sure that I've not made silly mistakes. When it comes to the orthography and when it comes to things like just the accents and stuff. And because I decided to move on to slides just a couple of days ago, I've not really given myself that amount of time. So apologies in that respect for that. Let's go back to my slides with all the errors and flaws apologised for. Let me get back to dramatising the matter at hand. So I've put in the chat the link to the slides if you want to get them, okay, just the PDF of all of these things, okay. So let me actually talk about them. The matter at hand is prepositional dative constructions, okay. So, and pretty much all the examples I have here will involve give, and to some extent the claims I make will be specific to give and send, or what typically translates as send. I think to some degree some of the things I've got in here I generalise, but I haven't done as much work on different predicates as I would normally like to do. But so with all that, nevertheless, like here's a couple of examples from Irish and Scottish Gaelic. Sorry, these are just from Irish. I'm going to go between Irish and Scottish Gaelic throughout, okay, just to mention that, okay. Because I'll be drawing upon some data from Mackie and Boyle in particular, which is an inspiration for this work. So most of the Irish data comes from them or from Donald Boyle. Okay, but the Gaelic data, unless otherwise indicated, is from on-field work and interviews with Gillibrich and McMillan, who's a professor of Gaelic at the University of Glasgow. Okay, he's also a Gaelic singer, who some of you might have heard sing before. Okay, I have an enormous debt to him for everything I've done in Scottish Gaelic. So what the examples I wanted to show are cases of the double object construction not being possible and a prepositional dative being possible in Irish, right? So gave me, you know, I'm not going to read the Irish because I'll probably maul it. Okay, I might read some of the Gaelic, but I'll probably maul that as well. So example one is the Irish version of Mary gave many apples to Sean in the background. Okay, and what you see is you've got the order of direct object, indirect object, and the indirect object is marked as something which has been glossed as a preposition. Okay. And two demonstrates this with send as the different preposition, okay, an inflected version of it, okay. And what's not possible is what's given in 3, which is two direct marked objects, okay. So that's based on an attempt at a double object construction in Irish, and it's starved, it's not possible. The same holds in Scottish Gaelic, okay. So it's a non-alternating language, we get the prepositional dative, and I want to interrogate the prepositional dative, right? I want to try and think about what its argument structure is what the kind of derivation is involved in that. And I want to bring that to bear on the question of how to analyse the dative alternation more generally, which is a big issue for the theory of argument structure. Okay, so much of the theory of argument structure has revolved around trying to understand how we can get, two similar, possibly identical kind of thematic templates, as it were, for these ditransitives. One being the prepositional dative, one double object construction. Okay, and so the literature on this is enormous. Okay, it's involved people such as Andrew and his colleagues, where they've explored and are argued for different versions of the analysis of the dative alternation. Right, so here's a representation of 4 main camps, I would say, there are when it comes to the argument structure of the dative alternation. One where the prepositional dative is a distinct argument structure from a double object construction. There's where it's a kind of allocative small clause. There's also a kind of applicative analysis, which is distinct, just defended in Barrett's 1993. There's also the 2 versions of the analysis of prepositional datives where they're basically related to in a derivational relationship with the double object construction, but they're basically 2 different derivations from the same core argument structure. Okay, so one of those is represented by this citation here from Amazabal and Romero, which is that the double object construction is derived from prepositional dative. Larson's original 1988 proposal was similar in spirit. Chris Collins has argued for, picking up on previous proposals, that the double object construction is related by the prepositional dative because the prepositional dative is derived from a core double object construction. Now that's the analysis that I'm going to end up arguing for. Okay, it's a sort of convergence of my interests and the interests in that office through there, which is where Chris resides and everybody is right now. Okay, so the kind of questions I'm addressing with this is the reasoning of the literature on alternating language extends to non-alternating languages. What's the proper analysis of Celtic ditransitives? Okay, and in particular, I want to bring the analysis of Celtic ditransitive to bear on the analysis of the prepositional dative and the dative alternation. Okay, simply put, if it starts to look like, and this was what I'm going to argue is the case, that prepositional datives are derived from double object constructions, right? They show a footprint of double object construction in their derivation. That really should push us in the direction of a unified analysis for the alternation, right? Because how else would we have a footprint of double objecthood and prepositional datives if we don't have the alternation? So sort of a reason I'm going to pursue. And the evidence I'm going to have for saying that prepositional datives are derived from double object constructions is going to come from binding. It's going to come from some parallels with what Pearson calls inverse VO languages. And it's going to come from, if I get to it, some interactions between quantifier flow and pronouns and pronoun postposing. Actually, not just pronoun postposing, but pronouns. Okay. So the data is going to come from a couple of different sources. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the binding data, which was very much kind of builds on what the Andrew was involved in, which I'll summarise in a moment. And then I'm going to talk about some data which builds on Marquis and Boyle in particular, which interacts with Matt Pearson's work in Austronesian. Okay, and then this quantifier float data again picks up on observations by Marquis and Boyle, but extends them somewhat. Okay, so this is going to strengthen the case of the single base, and ultimately, like, you know, I'm not really going to focus on this, but the type of analysis I'm going to develop is going to be one which has a lot of predicate fronting and deriving Celtic clause structure, fronting of VP constituents, right? Hopefully that will, you know, the argument I would ultimately like to make as part of this project is that we really do want to derive Celtic clause structure by predicate fronting rather than verb raising from head to head. I think that becomes kind of nearly inevitable, but we can come back to that. Interesting. So let's talk about some previous approaches to the, in particular, the case of the prepositional datives in Scottish Gaelic. Okay, so kind of one great early work on this was done. It was Heidi Harley's proposal, right? Well, Heidi Harley's proposal, in particular, in 2002 paper for the dative alternation, right? Say for English and for the languages like it, which had the alternation, she argued that these derive from different arrangements in a prepositional small clause, right? And so she claimed that the prepositional dative is derived from the structure on the left here. Okay, this kind of P-lock structure. So you have both the prepositional dative and double object derived from a core PP small clause, which a kind of verbal head is merged on top of with sort of causal semantics. Okay, but for the prepositional dative, you have a kind of P lock, which just has a locative semantics. And then the double object construction, you have a sort of P have, which has a possessive semantics. Okay. And a big part of the motivation for that was actually the distinctions that we see between the two constructions, which are often argued to be analysed in semantic terms, which is explicable in terms of these different semantics at the core here. That's been a live area of research and discussion in the last like 15, 20 years, and I'm not going to engage with those, but rather I'm going to talk about really the syntactic. Okay. Now, one of the really interesting things that Heidi Harley claimed in that paper, and really took this into the comparative realm, which I really appreciate, was that if languages could vary in whether or not they had P have, right? So P have was this core of the double object construction, right? And it's basically a lexical item in your inventory, okay? And some languages don't have it. Those are languages that don't have main verb have, right? And Scottish Gaelic is one of those. There are many languages that don't have main verb have for predicative possession. And she said that, right, so if a language doesn't have that, it also doesn't have the double object construction, right? So Scottish Gaelic doesn't have a double object construction, as we mentioned earlier on. It's because it doesn't have P have, right? So it has to resort to the P lock for its ditransitive purposes, okay? So I think a really interesting, like strongly predictive theory, right? The kind of theory that really pushed things forward in terms of making us think comparatively about argument structure, right? So what this does is correctly predicts for Scottish Gaelic that there will be a haveless language, okay? So Scottish Gaelic famously uses prepositional construction such as six to derive its predicative possession, okay? There's some issues, however, which were identified in work that subsequently, including also in Harley's work. So one thing that Harley pointed out is that, discussed is there are some double object construction languages that seem to have double object constructions, maybe a matter of analysis, but there's some languages like Russian that really, if you dig into it, really do look like they have the double object construction. Maybe the dig into it's the point of debate. But Russian's maybe in one case, there are others that need to be explored, okay? And those are non-have languages as well. So how could you derive a double object construction if you don't have? The cross-linguistic correlations question in some work, okay? Another issue that was identified by Heidi Hartley and Andrew with a graduate student who was working there, I think she led on this project, Jung. So I'm just going to refer to this as JCH for the sake of brevity. This is in a handout, which Andrew shared with me a while back. Which is kind of paper-like in its length and its detail. And so it was very much the pushing off point for this project when I really got started on it. So thanks to Andrew for sharing it. They identified some issues with the kind of P lock analysis of the prepositional dative construction. Okay. So one of the things they pointed out, so we'll start with example 8 actually, is there's a possibility of what looks like backwards binding from the indirect object into the direct object, right? So 8 has a universal quantifier as the wrong preposition actually, so I should have the wrong preposition in 8. It's one thing I've made a mistake for, okay? That should be dull, okay? This is a Scottish Gaelic example. The backwards binding possibility doesn't obviously follow from the argument structure, the core argument structure, which was assumed for the P-lock structure, which is where the indirect object is actually the possessor, which starts out very low, at the lowest point in that prepositional small clause, right? So this hierarchy doesn't predict the C command facts in 8. And likewise, if you take the P-lock to be how you derive predicative possession type structures, 7 is also an issue as well. I'm not going to dwell on that too much, okay? So that was the initial pushing off point, one of the pushing off points for John Carney and Harley, okay? And backwards binding, this possibility isn't a general thing in the language, right? So we need to kind of take this seriously. This data shows this, and Gillian Ramchand had another kind of paper-sized handout where she also discussed these matters. And that was something that Andrew and his colleagues were picking up on. Okay, so what JCH argued was that we should actually derive the Scottish Gaelic and Irish prepositional datives from a PHAV, basically from a double object construction co-op, right? This is the kind of analysis they had, right? So what they had is PHAV at the bottom, right? PHAV is at the bottom. And so the absence of have clauses as in I have a book in the language was explaining a different meaning. So it had a different parameter for explanation, okay? And I'm not going to get into that because that's a whole other NYU seminar on predicative possession, which is something we're always talking about over here, okay? But if you look at what's going on here, you start out with a structure where Lure, the book, a book starts out in the very, very bottom of the structure, and it raises from the complement of PHAV, right? So you've got the indirect object and the specified indirect object in the complement position of this prepositional small clause, but you're raising some sort of a movement of the, looks like a movement of the direct object over the indirect object, okay? And it's the higher position which they identify as spec voice P, okay? So, and this is the kind of analysis. So it's a push in the direction of analysing these as a PHAV construction, as a double object construction, right? So this is my pushing off point, and this is like, I think this is fundamentally right in this kind of core, right? Which is that we do derive these from a double object construction. I'm going to depart in some details. I'm going to develop a more articulated analysis on the basis of some kind of misgivings that I have about this precise type of derivation. So some things that I was thinking, well, I would derive this slightly differently. What we're going to predict if we do it differently. So let's get into some of those issues, right? So the issues, some of which are addressed in their kind of their handout, their manuscript, is so with that type of derivation, which is there's a locality issue with raising direct object or the indirect object. Okay, I'll talk about that in a second. There's a reconstruction sort of issue, if not necessarily problem. Okay, likewise the backwards binding issue, which I've mentioned in the third bullet here, which I won't really dwell on. There's the case marker analysis. Skip back a bit. The analysis of the indirect object here is as a nominal, as a DP, right? So the DO is analysed as a kind of case marker on the DP, right? So David Adger's actually proposed something similar for different deployments of DO and recent work as well. And this is actually quite like what Chris Collins does for biphrases in his work as well. Okay, so that's something I'm going to want to depart from as well for reasons that I'll elaborate on. And that won't really speak too directly to some of the issues initially, but it will become more apparent why I think this is important as we proceed. Okay. So, and there's some, so those are the issues I'm identifying as a pushing off point for an elaboration of this structure. And there's some floating quantifier facts, which I'll come to, which are a ton of fun, or I'll try and get to those later on. Okay. So let me dwell upon those issues and talk about how I might want to go about getting an alternative solution, right? So the first issue I mentioned is a locality issue. How are we able to, this derivation here, this long arrow involves quite a long instance of what I assume to be a movement. So kind of obligatory movement of the theme over the recipient of the indirect object, okay? This is the kind of thing we normally rule out with A intervention, right? So Anastopoulos' book, as you can hear, my Greek is even worse than my Gaelic. She argues, many other people in that literature have argued that this type of movement is the kind of thing we don't really want to see. We want to be able to say that locality holds of A movement quite strongly. What we have here is the A movement of the theme over the recipient. So I want to try and push that and push that forward, kind of inspired by the way that Chris has done this in his work. Okay. The reconstruction issue, let me just talk about that briefly. Again, this is related to some variation in the data, which I find very interesting, which I don't have a kind of principled understanding of, but have some hunches. And so variation in the data concerns, well, let me just talk about the thing that doesn't seem to vary, which is if you come back to the binding data, which John Carlin and Halley took as a pushing off point, I remember what we said is that the backwards binding was very much a possibility. Everyone seems to get this. Everyone I've asked allows this possibility of binding from the recipient into the theme, okay? I call this backwards binding, right, descriptively, okay? So to derive this, we would probably say we have to minimally optionally reconstruct the direct object back to a position where it's C commanded by the indirect object, okay, right? So this is the optionality, perhaps, or at least the possibility of reconstruction. That's what that analysis was aimed to capture, as I understand it, okay? I want to put it back in a position where it can be C commanded by every boy in what would be an A position, right? There seems to be some variation, and I've seen this, and that's also, just comparing my sources within the other paper sources, Juncan and Halley. So for their speaker, the possibility of the forward binding from the direct object into the indirect object, that's what's going on in 12, which is Scottish Gaelic, and 13, which is Irish. I now can't remember if 13 was footnoted in this paper. I think they did have a footnote in this paper, but I can't remember. The 13 I got from an Irish speaker as well. Okay, but 12 I've put a percentage mark on this, and what this indicates is some speakers, so the John Carley and Halley's data source, said they did not allow this binding possibility, right? So the forwards binding for the theme into the recipient wasn't possible, which is striking, right? That's striking. Very interesting and striking. Backwards binding is possible, forwards binding is not. And we'll see this in another language shortly, okay? That's this case for some speakers. The speaker that I worked with, Gilabreach, he had no real problem with it. I do believe I encountered at least one other speaker. I can't remember details if we interviewed for this now, but I've encountered variation on this point as well. Okay, so some speakers allow it, other people's speakers don't. And the Irish speakers that I've asked about 13 allowed the binding from the quantifier into the subsequent indirect object. But I think it was in a footnote of their paper that wasn't possible. Okay, and for the Irish speakers in interview. So this is a point of variation. We want to understand that, right? What this seems to indicate is for some speakers, one way to talk about it in terms of the analysis is that there's obligatory reconstruction of that A moved argument. Okay. Obligatory reconstruction, and for other speakers, it's optional reconstruction of that moved direct object. Okay, I'm not really sure how we're going to capture this. I want to have a neater understanding of what might go on there. I'm not saying this is a kind of real problem from their analysis, but it kind of mystified me, not understanding what the nature of this variation would be. Why would speakers differ, and whether or not the reconstruction was obligatory or possible? Okay, so I hope I'm not made a mess of explaining that empirical issue, but I just want it to be clear that the backwards binding is possible for everyone. The forward binding is possible for some. Where's that variation? What kind of structural explanation do we want to have for that? Okay. Okay, so I've got some just things showing what I mean by this. I should have probably dwelled on these. You see the reconstruction of a phename back to a position below the indirect object would get the C command required, right? But in order to avoid that, you'd have to kind of, in order to explain the fact that some speakers don't allow the binding in this configuration, you'd have to say that the reconstruction is not possible. Okay. I have some other things about the backwards binding method I mentioned there. Let's talk about the preposition stuff, right? And this is, again, it's not super crucial to John Carley and Halley, but I think it's interesting. And it takes me into territory that I kind of want to be in for the discussion of pronoun postposing, is that the analysis involves taking the do, the marker of the indirect object, to be a sort of case marker of sorts. It's not analysed as a preposition in the classical sense. Okay, now that involves extending our understanding of case markers, and this is not unique to them. As I said, Chris Collins has done this, some other people have done this in the literature. It's not unique as an issue. And maybe you can say there are languages that have a hell of a lot of case markers where other languages use prepositions. This might not be an issue. But this does include things like go, which is a directional preposition with what seems to be directional semantic contributions. Analysing that as a case marker, I'm not super clear on it. It involves extending the inventory of case markers. Okay. Son's another one that's involved in this. This might be the case, but kind of made me a bit concerned. But to turn to some real empirical issues, I think more substantial empirical issues for analysing the marker of the indirect object as a case marker rather than a preposition. So one example which I want to talk about is a case like 15. So what we have in 15 is a WH question formed on the indirect object and a prepositional dative construction in Scottish Gaelic. Okay, right. I got this specific example from kind of just searching a Gaelic dictionary. Okay, and I believe this is iterable, although I've not got a ton of data that I've checked with many speakers, right? But what's shown here is a case of WH movement, right? And WH movement of an element which is the complement of preposition typically involves what we call pipe piping with inversion in this language, right? So we get basically who to, right? Who to gave you hospitality, right? Who to, I can't believe I tried to pronounce that well, speaking with a dry mouth. right? So what we have here is pipe piping with inversion. You get who to, even though in the language it's a prepositional language, right? And you've got the inflection of the preposition as well, right? This is something we get, pipe piping with inversion, right? Inversion of the complement of the preposition with the preposition just when it undergoes WH fronting. We see this in other verb initial languages dotted around, right? It's not super common, but we get it in unrelated verb initial languages that show a reasonable number of properties in common with Scottish Gaelic and Irish, right? So this is kind of exotic in an interesting way from the kind of rest of European languages perspective. This to me, one of the nicest analysis I've seen of this, so David Adler kind of sketched it in his recent paper, is that this involves kind of movement of the WH expression to the edge of the preposition phrase, okay? But like what I really want to emphasize, so that involves like a reasonable amount of structure. I'm not really sure I want to do that with the relevant marker being a K-head or a case marker. I don't know of anything else like this that I've seen involving case markers, as far as I can understand it, right? Another thing to say is when we look at pipe piping with inversion across these unrelated languages, it usually treats, as I understand it, always treats prepositions as a natural class rather than case markers as a natural class. So if it was the case that case markers and prepositions were kind of overlapping in this domain, it might be a bit surprising. Okay, this looks like a prepositional behaviour, basically. Okay, maybe a more direct argument for analysing these indirect objects as PPs comes from the consideration of clefts. Right, again, you can cleft a bunch of stuff in Scottish Gaelic, right? Gaelic speakers love their clefts. This is Gaelic. I haven't marked it. I think I got the specific example from searching a dictionary. Okay, and just to be certain, because I come up with a particular set of slides in the last week, and I just wanted to double check the examples. I haven't got time to look at a bunch of speakers, but as I understand it, this is completely ordinary Gaelic. And what we've got here is so clefting of the indirect object, right? So Caibh. What's interesting about Scottish Gaelic in particular is we have two different cleft expletives, right? So the it of it is, of it's Gary that I spoke to, right? So that's the own here, the second word here, own, right? You get own with prepositional cleft pivots in particular, and you get a, which looks like it, right? Unsurprisingly, with DP cleft pivots, okay? So, and David Adler, in a kind of really interesting paper from 2011, argued that the relevant, it's not just PPs and DPs that this the own A thing cuts across. He argued it cuts across a semantic class, and he took basically the relevant distinction to be between elements in particular of a denotation of type E, and I can't remember exactly what denotation he gave to the other class, the non-type E denotation cleft pivots, right? But basically here, the semantic analysis of which of the two you got, right? Whether or not that's right, it was a semantic analysis of which pivot you get. Now, if we were to say that Caibh is basically a DP, but it's got a sort of case marker on it, we would probably expect it with this sort of semantic diagnostic to behave like DP rather than a PP, and you'd probably expect to get A as the cleft pivot rather than Caibh. Now, we could argue about this by arguing with David, as we all love to do, about whether or not he's right about that semantic analysis of the cleft pivot, but it's another sign that these really are PPs rather than DPs, okay? So I want to push on that later, okay? Just do this, something else. Okay, so the analysis, the alternative I've got, which I want to spell it in detail here, is going to be similar to the Jean Carney and Harley one, and I'm going to derive the prepositional datives from double object constructions, right? But it's going to be different with respect to, in particular, the locality issue, how that's resolved, and also how the indirect object gets to be derived. So one main thing I'm going to say is, right, so you're going to get the VP at the very core. I've said a small clause, but really I'm just going for comments of VP. You're going to have a core predication which involves the indirect object and the direct object. We'll just call it a VP, right? Indirect object is going to be hierarchically more prominent than the direct object, right? And then what's going to happen is the indirect object raises out of that VP, okay? And it's going to raise to a claim the complement of the preposition. And this is going to be an instance of what McCloskey and Sells identified as a more general thing in other configurations in Irish, which is situations where you have raising from a DP argument position or nominal argument position to a preposition. This is raising to the complement of preposition, right? But basically, the indirect object raises to become a PP. Okay, I'll come to the details of that later on. Okay, and it gets out of that core VP. And then what's going to happen is, in order to derive the direct object, indirect object order, is we're going to move the VP over that indirect object. So the indirect object's in spec of apple P's. I'm just kind of combining a few things. So it's like a raising applicative in particular. And then once we've got that in that spec of apple P, you move the VP, you smuggle the direct object over the indirect object, right? So the A locality issue is resolved here because you've moved a VP over an indirect object. That's not got a locality issue in the same way that moving a DP over an indirect object does, right? That's the whole nature of Chris Collins's notion of smuggling. You move a VP, you smuggle direct object over the indirect object by moving it within a VP shell, right? And notice what's going on in that structure as well. That direct object in its hierarchically more prominent position still doesn't C-command the indirect object. You're going to have to do something else to make that direct object C-command that indirect object. So if it's going to bind into it, that direct object's not going to be able to stay where it is. It's going to have to shift a bit. That's going to be important. Okay, so that's the smuggling analysis. Version of Chris Collins' analysis of the English derivation. He does something very similar. We'll come to that bit. So we meet the locality problem in a more general way, right? The PP hood is sort of captured by saying, hey, it's a PP, right? But this analysis that I have, raising to the complement of preposition, should lead us to expect that these indirect objects should be DP-like in certain ways. That's something I'll come to later on, right? And I've said this involves raising to the complement of preposition. Some of you might have went, God, what the hell are you doing? Why are you taking us into this territory? This is territory that Irish and Scottish Gaelic occupies. McCloskey and Sells made that case. I'm not really convinced that calling this raising to case solves the problem. In case I'm going to try and understand these facts more generally, okay? And the hierarchy facts, I think, are captured fairly systematically, in particular this point of variation about whether or not so the structure I just proposed there should derive fairly straightforwardly the indirect object C-commanding direct object. You just reconstruct the predicate that was moved. Predicates reconstruct. Cool, fine, we know that, right? They need to reconstruct. What about the situation, the variation between whether or not speakers allowed the direct object to C-command the indirect object, right? The forwards binding. That was possible for Derivation, but it wasn't possible for Muriel, as I understand it, right? And so the claim is that what we have to do is an extra instance of object movement out of the fronted VP. So Chris Collins has this in his analysis of English, and his analysis of English is kind of more or less obligatory, but not entirely, right? And that undergoes that extra instance of what should be string vacuous A movement to spec of, say, agar P at some position, right? It will C-command the indirect object. And so then what you can say, well, what's the difference between one class of speakers who allow the forwards binding and the other classes who don't? Well, it's a difference whether or not they have acquired the possibility of this string vacuous scrambling. And that's something we can understand as being a point of variation, right? It can inspire the Hannah Al paper from a few years back, which was about some interesting facts to do with Korean negation. You know, string vacuous movement rules may be quite hard for speakers to acquire, and so we may expect them to do something that varies. Okay, so that's my kind of account of these issues, right? Now, what I want to do next, and I'm going to probably not get to some of the really interesting data concerning the floating quantifiers, but I want to really talk about the next case, which involves rightward shift of arguments. I'm going to pick up on some kind of precedents and parallels from previous work. Right, and I've already talked through Chris Collins' analysis. This is his analysis of English, and that was motivated by very similar looking data, right? So his case for the analysis of the double object being core and the indirect of the double object construction being sort of core and then prepositional data being derived was there was a strong C-command asymmetry in the double object construction. Indirect object asymmetrically C-commands direct object. That seems clear. That seems robust across other languages, right? That's what's shown by 17, he argued. And what's also been shown by various works, and Chris picked up on this, is that in prepositional datives, there's not really a strong asymmetric C-command between one argument to the other. Rather, it seems to be the case that both backwards and forwards binding are possible in English, right? So 18b would indicate that you can possibly bind from the indirect object into the direct object. Not everyone gets this judgment. For some people like myself, it's like, yeah, it's more or less fine. But other speakers are like, no, right? What I have found is for many speakers, if you make the indirect object heavier, which is often where prepositional datives behave most double object-like, if you make that happen, then the backwards binding becomes even more possible. Okay, so I think that this is a real issue that Chris has put his finger on, this asymmetry of centuries. Okay, and so the backwards binding dative from English kind of resembles a Scottish Gaelic dative, right? So there's a kind of parallel to draw here, right? I'm just going to skip over the Armenian alternative because I'm kind of low on time, but in another version of this talk, I spent a lot more time interacting with and arguing with ad Neilman in my imagination. Now, what I do want to mention to bring into this fold here, looking at this backwards binding possibility, is this isn't just like, English, French, and Irish and Scottish Gaelic. So there's this fascinating work by Matt Pearson where he argues that a very similar thing is seen with double object constructions in Malagasy. And I say double object constructions, I mean DOCs, where both arguments are direct marked and there's no prepositions involved. Now, in Malagasy, as in a lot of languages, you get direct object, indirect object order of ditransitive, right? And in particular, he identifies languages of this type as inverse VO languages, and they show basically the inverse with respect to certain VP level properties to languages like English, which are also VO languages, and also OV languages, which typically basically look like, with respect to hierarchy effects, English type languages, right? So what do I mean by this? Well, so I'll come back to an illustration of the other factors that Pearson talks about. But what's important for Pearson is that the hierarchy, well, the order facts of Malagasy and English are different. The hierarchy facts are very similar, basically the same. Well, maybe not the same, but very similar, which is that there's asymmetric C command from the indirect object into the direct object. And the backwards binding possibility is possible, but the forwards binding is not possible. That's a 21AMB show. Right, so it's like this is the Muriel's grammar in effect, right? The grammar where you can bind backwards from the indirect object into the direct objects, but not forwards. Okay, and it just looks like the English double object construction, but the arguments are in the opposite order. Okay, so Pearson has an analysis of this fact, which looks an awful lot like what I've just done there, right? And it's very much an inspiration for this, at least for my version of it, which is that, again, you derive double direct object, indirect object order without prepositions involved by moving a VP containing direct object over the indirect object. And when you do that, the direct object doesn't C command the indirect object unless you shift it further out, right? And this predicate fronting analysis is particularly motivated for Malagasy because this is an VOS language, right? A VOS language, subject final. And, it's quite standard these days in the Austronesian literature to analyze subject final derivations as involving remnant VP movement, right? Remnant predicate fronting. So this type of analysis, which might look a bit abstract and strange for English, might look a bit abstract and strange for Scottish Gaelic and Irish, is completely way more accepted and really should be something we allow you to do in the realm of Austronesian, right? So that's a parallel I want to pick up. Another parallel I want to pick up on is that these languages like Malagasy, which involve what I'm saying is also involved in Scottish Gaelic and Irish, that is deriving the kind of basic order in the VP by means of verb movement of VP flares rather than just DPs moving over each other. This leads us to expect that you will see different order effects of other types, right? And in particular, what Pearson says is that in these inverse VO languages, right, such as Malagasy, identifies a few others. The reason he calls them inverse is because you get like direct object, indirect object order and ditransitives. Also, when they do something like object shift of specific objects, it seems to go rightwards in the sequence, rather than leftwards, right? There's also some adverb backs, which I won't get near, unfortunately, right? So I'm going to talk about the rightward shift, because rightward shift should be something that the Scottish Gaelic and Irish scholars among you recognise, although I'm going to talk about some data which maybe less familiar, and I think pretty compelling and interesting when it comes to motivating these at first seemingly more abstract structures for derivation of our basic argument structure, right? So to introduce the issue at hand, we're talking about the shift of specific objects, a class of specific objects, right? So we know that there is various verb-object languages, right, to use sort of Greenbergian terminology, such as the Scandinavian languages and English, or English as it's rendered here, that they may shift to some degree pronominal or specific arguments, right? So some VO languages will, so for instance, English, so we could talk more about Scandinavian, but you see that Danish and other mainland Scandinavian languages shift just pronouns. They do object shift, right? Just specific pronouns. Okay, English has this to some degree. And we also see leftward shift over adverbs in particular, much like in Danish, of specific full DPs and OV languages, right? So this is something that's familiar to us, leftward shift of definite but not indefinite arguments. We see this in VO languages and in OV languages. And that's what Pearson calls inverse VO languages. We get shift of a certain class of specific arguments, so definites, but it goes rightward, right? So you see the indefinite occurs in one position, close to the verb, that's in 25a, but the definite shifts further away from the verb, right? His analysis of this, which I think is fairly common in the analysis in the literature these days, some version of this seems to be adopted fairly widely now, is in order to derive rightward shift of DP arguments, specific arguments, you're basically doing the same thing that you do in OV languages. That is, you move, there's a scrambling position or a topicalization position, which is clause internal, it's a leftward specifier, and you move, say, definite DPs to that. That's what's shown in this diagram on the left. But the difference in an inverse VO language is that there's kind of, at least to some degree, shift of, so in the case of Malagasy, harmonic shift of VP layers whenever you do a leftward movement to a position like this. So you leftward move the DP to, say, the I top P, right, as a sort of clause internal focus position, topic position, and then you shift the VP that's been evacuated over that. And that will derive you the appearance of rightward shift, much like in a Larsonian analysis of extraposition, where this is movement to a kind of definite specific specifier, right? So Pearson argues for something like this. You shift the definite, then you move the VP, and you get the appearance of rightward shift of arguments, okay? This is something you get when you've got this VP movement, right? If you've not got a VP movement in derivation in your structures, you don't expect to see that, okay? You don't expect to see rightward drift, okay? Now, I'll just slide and job. I'm not going to dwell upon that. Now, there's a clear parallel to be drawn here with the kind of Irish and Scottish Gaelic. And ultimately, what I want to say is that Irish and Scottish Gaelic are what Pearson calls inverse VO languages, right? Which is they allow for shift of specific arguments that goes rightwards rather than leftwards, right? And that's because they're basically the same. They're moving these specific arguments to the leftward position, but then they're moving the evacuated VP over it, much like I did for the movement, the indirect object, and then movement, the VP containing direct object over it, right? There's a degree of VP fronting involved in derivation of these, right? Now, this is famously the case descriptively in terms of the order facts that pronouns in Scottish Gaelic and Irish shift rightwards rather than leftwards, right? So rather than moving to the kind of Wackernagel second position, we move rightwards to a kind of bunch of different positions and the order, and there's weak pronouns undergo this, right? So there's an example from Irish and one from Scottish Gaelic, okay? So this is kind of like Danish, but in the opposite direction, right? It's like a VO or an inverse and direct. You can basically take Danish and Scottish Gaelic on the other hand, right? Because they've got an awful lot of properties in common, right? I've just listed some of them here. Don't just move to a dedicated position, but to a bunch of different positions, possibly between adverbials. Danish can do that, so can Scottish Gaelic and Irish with its pronoun postposing. So in short, pronoun postposing is the kind of thing we would expect to get if we've got these VP movements. And that's basically the analysis and the work of Nigel Duffield. I've got a whole other paper where I argue for a version of Nigel Duffield's analysis of pronoun postposing. But what I want to make clear is that we're saying that this is a footprint of kind of being an inverse language which moves VPs, right? You get rightward drift of arguments rather than leftward drift, right? Because you move leftward and then you move the evacuated VP over. That's what you're doing fairly systematically, Okay. So some stuff about this. I've also got stuff about this that I'm not going to dwell upon. Well, I want to take the last like 5 minutes, however much I've got left, possible. How much time do I have, Andrew?
You're over your talk time. The talk officially ends at 12, but we often go over.
Okay, right, sorry.
Go over. It's okay.
Yeah, so let me just kind of slam through some of this remaining stuff, which is to do with some other right. So I won't take any more than 5 minutes. What I want to talk about is another instance of rightward shift of arguments in this language, which once we look at the hierarchy facts, we cross-cut it with the hierarchy facts. It pushes in the direction of the kind of analysis that I'm advocating, in particular for ditranslatives, right? And this picks up on work by Mackie and Boyle in particular, okay? I'm mainly going to talk about the Irish data here. The Scottish Gaelic data, I've got some here, but it's more complicated, right? But it involves another instance of what we might call direct object postposing, right? So we've seen pronoun postposing, weak pronouns in particular, weak direct object pronouns can shift rightwards to a bunch of different positions. That's established in that literature. You can also shift to some extent direct objects in Irish to the right of the indirect objects that they come with. Okay, so if you look at what's given in 32 and 33, right, this is from this Mackie and O'Boyle paper, right? These aren't both possible in Scottish Gaelic, right? Versions of them are, but they're not entirely possible for the speakers that I've been able to ask, right? But they're possible and given as grammatical, and checked it with Donald Boyle in that paper by Mackie and O'Boyle, right? So if you look at the order in 32, you've got a counting quantifier, say plenty apples, right? Which occurs to the right of the indirect object, right? Whereas the kind of base order, the kind of standard order is for the direct object, indirect object. So it looks like this has been postposed at least a little bit. You can't postpose it any further, by the way, right? The direct object can't go any further that way. It can only just go just to the right of the preposition phrase, okay? That's also the case in 33, right? A kind of slightly simplified version of that example. And this is actually based on an example from a modified version of an example from Harlow 2002. What you've got here is a definite direct object. And what Mackie and O'Boyle point out is that this is possible with definite direct objects and quantificational definite direct objects, but not with bare indefinites. 34 is ungrammatical. It's not possible to do this with bare indefinites. This should remind us of Malagasy. This should remind us of German, right? Which is that we get shift of direct objects and quantificational objects, but not weak indefinites, right? Again, we're talking about rightwards, not leftwards. How are we going to do that? This is going to give us this is going to fall out from, I argue, the kind of derivation I sketched out later on, right? So let's just, I have to skip the Gaelic tasting, I'm afraid, as much as some of you might want it, but there's more to be worked out there anyway. But again, let's kind of use this type of analysis that I've developed and develop it a bit more in order to capture these facts and then spell out the predictions. So remember, the analysis was of the kind of just direct object, indirect object order. Zooming in on the bottom of the clause is that you move the VP containing the direct object over the indirect object, right? That's this kind of VP movement to spec of XP. I've just called it XP here for the sake of a lack of commitments, right? And the indirect object had moved out of that VP into the spec of Apple P, which is below that position where that lands it, okay? Right? In order to derive, inspired by the Pearson type of analysis, in order to derive the direct object being final in this layer of the structure, what you can do is posit a scrambling position which is similar to the scrambling position that you would get in Pearson's analysis of Malagasy and arguably in German, which would be below the Apple P position, but above the VP position. And that's a position that you can only move certain arguments of a certain type, right? Quantificational type. Again, just like with Malagasy, right? So there's something specific to this projection that allows it to host definites and quantificational expressions. You shift to that before you do the VP fronting, and then you get the appearance of a rightward movement of direct object, but it's leftward, right? Now look at the hierarchy here. The direct object is still below the indirect object. If I was extraposing from, say, a much higher position, that wouldn't be the hierarchy we would get. So this makes predictions, right? And they're testable in Irish, and I think they make the right predictions, because we can take these indirect object, direct object orders and see how the binding works, right? So this is the example in 38, was given to me by Donald Boyle, is when you've got the indirect object, direct object order, the forwards binding, so Donald Boyle allowed the forwards binding from direct object into the indirect object, but he also allows the forwards binding with the direct object, indirect object into the direct object, as indicated by 38. This ought not to be possible if this direct object was super high. Minimally, we can say that this is something that's predicted by saying that the direct object has stayed low. So this is the type of structure that we posit. What's more interesting is the second prediction, which is given to you with star in 39. And this is again from Donald Boyle. That is the backwards binding. So Donald Boyle had no problem with backwards binding in the standard configurations. But in these ones where we've got the indirect object preceding the direct object, it's given in 39, the backwards binding, which is the only thing that's a problem here, wasn't possible, right? Not possible. Even though backwards binding was completely fine from the indirect object into the direct object, right? Why would that be the case, right? The claim, again, of the analysis I've got here is that in order for the direct object to be postposed, it has to move out of the VP that moves into the higher position. That's what I've got here, this Gaffleoris and the spec of the scrambling position. And it should be able to do that because it's a quantificational element, right? But if it's going to bind the element that moved out of that VP, right? So that's the indirect object, what's going to happen is two reconstructions. You're going to have to reconstruct the VP, and then you're going to have to reconstruct the thing that moved out of that VP. And that's something that we know is typically not possible. That's what's attributed to Barr's generalization. That is, when you front a predicate, you can't reconstruct into it. You fix scope. You can't reconstruct into a fronted predicate. So this kind of little double exclamation mark, triple exclamation mark says that this reconstruction shouldn't be possible on the basis of kind of general predicate reconstruction properties that's been talked about in the literature. Given that, this is predicted by this analysis, right? If we were just extraposing these quantifiers, this would not be expected, right? So this elaborated structure that I've given you here, where the postposed argument is lower rather than higher, is motivated by this, okay? Motivated by this data. So hopefully that gives you an indication of why there's more data involving floating quantifiers that I could elaborate on. But that's kind of why I think this more elaborated structure for the prepositional datives is motivated. It explains these hierarchy facts. It explains these hierarchy facts in the postposed cases, and it captures the parallels with respect to postposing across languages elsewhere. Okay, so I should stop at this point because I'm massively over time, but I'd love to hear any questions you've got or anything else. So,
thank you, Gary. Please, everyone, thank our speaker. Ooh. Very fascinating stuff, and my brain is just going to at the moment. Are there any questions for Gary? I knew Heidi would have one. Go ahead, Heidi.
There we go. Thanks a lot for this wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it very much. I'm so happy to see people continuing to dive into these damn constructions. The one kind of test that I would, so you're relying pretty heavily on the on the binding data.
Yep.
And one thing that I really like to see in these analyses is the sort of convergence of evidence from various kinds of tests. And I worked a lot thinking about the idiom stuff. I don't know if we know enough about idioms in Gaelic to really get a handle on that. But the one corner, and again, I don't know anything about how these work in Gaelic, the one test that occurred to me as you're proposing all the leftward movements that might be interesting to think about is the depictives test that Pilkinen talked about. We got some mileage out of it, and in English, Jung and I, in our 2015 paper, but it would be super interesting because I think your proposal is going to make some pretty concrete predictions about depictives that are going to be quite different from any kind of like base generated order stories. So I'm curious about that. Anyway, and that's very clever to use that, to smuggle that sucker over the other guy, because you're absolutely right about the locality issues, and smuggling is your sneaky way around it. Although then one wonders, when can you smuggle him in? Anyway, never mind.
That's a very legitimate concern, as they say in toxic political discourse. So the depictive stuff, I have not done that yet, but I know it can be done. I know that's something I could be doing. So that's on my agenda of a number of things to talk to Gaelic about. I mean, in many ways, I think the quantifier float data pushes in a not wildly similar direction. So I think that the set of possible quantifier float associations is another test that I've tried. So the Janke and Nailman paper about English prepositional datives kind of tried to cross-cut things in that way as well, and it used those, and I was very much inspired by that. And I think that data, which I've kind of spent a lot of time prefacing but not talking through, pushes in the relevant direction. But yeah, I need to definitely do that. And as far as the idiom stuff is concerned, I certainly don't have the capacity to do that at this point, but I would definitely want to do that. And there's some related issue, which I think you guys talked about in your handout, is there's a sort of under-specification of the meaning of these verbs in Irish and Scottish Gaelic, which I think a good understanding of that from a sort of lexical semantics kind of sensitive perspective is going to give us similar, so it's going to be as informative as doing idiom stuff. And so in many ways, I want to just see, like, one thing I don't yet know is like some of these reorderings, do they interact at all with that? I would expect they don't, but just purely on the basis of hunches. So I would like to progress beyond hunches.
No, and I mean, I very much agree with that. All the, core discussions of this focus on give, and give is just the lightest of verbs. So it would be really interesting to kind of have a grip on that. Yeah.
I mean, like, one of the things that can convince me that like the binding data was like going to be important was in the handout that you guys, that Andrew sent me, was the fact that the backwards binding was possible with all the different types.
Very striking. Yeah.
Really striking, right? So like that to me was like, that's a finding right there. Yeah. And so, but I've not like looked at the quantifier float fact across all those predicates either. So I'm really, really keen to see how that works.
No, and it's so cool what you found when you were playing with the different orders. It's just, it's breaking my brain, like Andrew said. That's great. Thank you so much.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering, on page 19, you mentioned piping, and I'm wondering, slide 19, if there's like preposition stranding, or does it always go together? Is it always hold to rising to the top, or by any chance does to stay stranded at the bottom?
Yeah. A great question. Yes, this is something I didn't put a slide in for because I wanted to I'm 90%. So certainly speakers of Scottish Gaelic and Irish allow preposition. Certainly Scottish Gaelic allow preposition stranding. So there's a whole paper by Ajahn and Ramchand that 2005 that pick up on that. But I know for a fact that people allow it and they produce it. So that's another thing that, how do you strand the case marker? Don't know if I want to say what you can strand the case marker. This is something I've raised with Chris Collins before about his analysis of buy as a sort of case marker as well. He doesn't buy it as a big problem, but that's the question that I asked, and the answer is yes, the stranding is possible. And my conclusion is that's another reason to believe these really are PPs, because again, you get PPs, prepositions behaving as a natural class. As far as I know, pretty much all prepositions with the relevant speaker allow stranding as a natural class. So you don't get a distinction between the kind of functional prepositions and the non-functional prepositions in that domain, as far as I know. And to me, that goes in the direction of treating them as a natural class and therefore treating these as PPs. Maybe that therefore wasn't warranted, but so I'm still going to say it. So, yeah, thanks.
Appreciate it. Great talk. Appreciate it.
I have a real quick question, which is a what about question, which you can ignore.
I love what about questions.
So, your analysis of rightward shift as stranding, I can sort of buy it with the full NPs that are being, but the phonological evidence that Bennett et al. Have suggested that, and also I don't know if you caught her talk last week, but Gillian was talking about pronoun postposing as effectively just a stylistic phonological phenomenon. Whether you're grounding it really strongly in the syntax here, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, the phonological aspects of that.
I mean, for sure. There's the Bennett et al. Work. I mean, I know you sent me a kind of short paper where you picked up on this as well, right? Which is like Muriel really loves trochees, and that's what's driving this, right? And that's a finding, right? I don't think that prosodic prosodic generalizations entail prosodic analyses of what's otherwise looks very syntactic. So I think that, I'm of the sort of merge and filter sort of outlook. I think that we can say that the syntax can derive things that are phonologically good and less good, and that learners can learn generalizations over those. And they can learn a general strategy for deriving structures that fit with one thing rather than another. Which is to say, I think that the syntax has to be deriving pronoun postposing. I think it's fundamentally irreducibly syntactic. And I think there's the phonological optimization that's involved. That's definitely the case, but I don't think that entails a prosodic analysis of where it happens at PF. I understand why people want to do that sort of thing. Like, to me, it seems fundamentally anti-modular. But this is one of these leaky cases where modularity looks diciest. So but to me, this whole other talk that I could have given about a pronoun postposing, talk I gave to Gillian among other people last year, it involves similar sort of material, and I argue that there's a real syntactic character to pronoun postposing, right? So one thing that that's mentioned in Bennett et al. Is that the pronoun postposing, and I got examples of this in Scottish Gaelic as well. I've built a database of Scottish Gaelic pronoun postposing examples, which I'll share with you, similar to the one you sent me. It can proceed across the board. You can get across the board pronoun postposing. Why the hell would a purely phonological process do something otherwise we understand in terms of syntactic domains such as coordinations? I mean, that's a why the hell question, right? But that's a why the hell question that really entails there's no answer. And I think that's the case, and I think that's because that's not the kind of thing we expect at all. I mean, there's also there was a recent as in it yesterday, it popped up on Lingbuzz, a paper which was arguing against prosodic analyses of object shift in Germanic, and I think that's less controversial. It's recently people have said, well, let's put object shift and pronoun object shift and the Germanic type into PF, and the argument was it doesn't really do the job. I think that a similar argument is to be made, and that's the argument I want to make for pronoun postposing in Irish and Scottish Gaelic. It's just there are too many syntactic aspects to it, as far as I'm concerned. But for sure, the syntax gets crazier, right? For sure, right? There's some really interesting cases in Bennett et al. Which take a lot of imagination, but the Gaelic-speaking people I know are pretty imaginative. So
I would love to see that handout that you were talking about with the ATB stuff. Yeah. So are there any last questions? Maybe we have time for one more question, if there is one. All right, then. Let's thank our speaker. Very fascinating talk.